In 3 minutes, she would hit send on an email that was never meant for him. In 3 hours, the most dangerous man in Milan would have read every secret she had ever put on a page. In 3 months, she would understand that some mistakes don't ruin your life. They become it. But right now, Wren Calloway was just trying to meet a deadline. The apartment was the kind of small that stopped bothering you after the first year. 3rd floor walk-up, 1 window with good light, a second-hand velvet couch the color of something that used to be rose. Fairy lights strung along the bookshelf because she couldn't afford a proper lamp when she moved in, and never found a reason to replace them. They made the dark feel intentional, like a choice rather than a shortage. And it was 11:14 on a Tuesday, and the only sounds were rain against glass and the particular silence of a building where everyone else had already gone to sleep. Wren had not gone to sleep. Wren had 2 tabs open, half a cup of cold tea she kept forgetting to drink, and the specific tension behind her eyes that meant she had been staring at a screen for too long without blinking. 1 tab was Marco Bellini's manuscript, her current ghostwriting client, a semi-retired businessman who wanted a clean, safe love story published under his daughter's name as a birthday gift. Wholesome. Predictable. The kind of romance that resolves itself neatly inside 240 pages and leaves no damage. The other tab was hers. She had no name for it. No client. No deadline, except the one she invented for herself. The quiet compulsion that pulled her to the keyboard every night after the paid work was done, like a second heartbeat she couldn't turn off. The Alessandro novel. That was what she called it in her head, when she called it anything at all. She had been writing it for 2 years. Alessandro Vitale was not based on anyone she had ever met. She was clear about that, had been clear about it from the first page, from the first line. From the first time his character arrived fully formed in her imagination, like something she had always known and simply hadn't written down yet. He was fictional, entirely, completely, safely fictional. A man constructed from the architecture of want, the specific, embarrassing, never-spoken want of a woman who had never been chosen first. Not by her parents, none who had 2 daughters, and always seemed faintly surprised by Wren specifically. Not by Daniel, who had been kind enough, but had loved her the way you love a habit. Comfortably, without urgency, until the comfort ran out. Alessandro was the answer to a question she had stopped asking out loud. He was cold, the way expensive things are cold. Marble, glass, the air at altitude. He moved through rooms like the room had been waiting for him. He spoke rarely, and when he did, people listened. Not because he demanded it, but because the alternative felt unthinkable. He had a wound he never showed anyone. A grief that lived in his shoulders, in the particular stillness of him, in the way he stood at windows, looking at cities like he owned them and found no comfort in it. And he loved. When he finally loved, like a man who had decided. Completely. Irreversibly. Like choosing was the most natural thing he had ever done, and he simply hadn't found the right reason until her. Wren bit her lip and read back the last paragraph she had written. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't need to. He had already decided, somewhere between the moment she first defied him and the moment she first saw through him, that she was the only variable in his life he had no interest in solving. He wanted her unsolved. He wanted her exactly as she was, a question he intended to spend the rest of his life not answering. She exhaled slowly. Too much, she thought. Then, not enough. She saved the document, switched tabs. Marco Bellini's manuscript waited patiently. Chapter 12, the reconciliation scene. 300 words still needed before she could reasonably call it a night. She wrote them quickly, clean sentences, safe emotions, the kind of love that didn't cost anything. She attached the document to an email. Marco, she typed. Chapter 12 attached. The reconciliation scene runs a little long, but I think it earns it. Let me know your thoughts. She typed his email address from memory. Had typed it 40 times in the past 4 months. Didn't look twice. Didn't notice the domain. Didn't notice that her fingers, tired and slightly careless at 11:23 on a Tuesday night, had typed .com where they should have typed .it. She hit send, closed the laptop, made fresh tea she actually drank this time, went to bed. 3 floors below, in the rain-slicked street, a black car sat idling outside her building, not waiting for her. Not yet. Just circumstance. Just the ordinary machinery of a city at night. But in a penthouse on the other side of Milan, in an office where the city spread itself 30 stories below like an offering, a notification arrived in an inbox that a team of 3 people monitored around the clock for security threats. The assistant who flagged it read the subject line, Chapter 12, Reconciliation, and the sender name, W. Calloway, and found neither in any database that should have had access to this address. Standard protocol: trace, assess, delete. She forwarded it to her employer with a single line of text. Unknown sender, possible breach, awaiting instructions. In the same office, 30 floors above a city that had learned not to make noise when he was thinking, Adriano Vitale set down the document he was reviewing and opened the forwarded email. He would read 1 page, assess the threat level, delete it. But that was the plan. He read 1 page, then another. By the 3rd, he was no longer standing at his desk. By the 5th, he was at the window. By the time he reached the chapter where Alessandro stood over his sister's grave and felt nothing, not grief, not rage, just a silence so complete it had texture, had weight, had the specific quality of a man who has decided that feeling is a liability he can no longer afford. Adriano's hand was pressed flat against the cold glass, and the city below had ceased to exist entirely. He read the ending last, read it twice, set his phone down on the windowsill. Outside, rain moved across the city in slow sheets, dragging light with it. He watched it without seeing it. His reflection watched him back, dark suit, still face, and the particular expression of a man who has just been seen by someone who wasn't supposed to be looking. W. Calloway. He picked his phone back up. Find her, he said, when his assistant answered. Full profile, current address. I want it in an hour. A pause. Should I send someone? The rain pressed against the glass. No. He ended the call, looked at the manuscript still open on his screen, at the last line she had written. He wanted her unsolved. He wanted her exactly as she was, a question he intended to spend the rest of his life not answering. The corner of his mouth moved, almost imperceptibly, in the dark, in the empty office, with no one to see it. Then it stopped. He picked up his coat. The profile arrived in 53 minutes. Adriano read it the way he read everything, once, completely, without going back. Wren Calloway, a 25, ghostwriter, freelance, which meant invisible, no office, no colleagues, no professional footprint beyond a carefully anonymous portfolio website that listed no name and no photograph. 3rd-floor apartment on Via Pastrengo. Rent 2 months behind. 1 credit card. No car. No family in the city. No connection. Verified through 3 separate databases. To any family, organization, or individual with reason to surveil him. He set the profile down. Picked up the manuscript. He had told himself he was reading it for intelligence. That was the function. Identify the source of the breach. Assess the level of threat. Determine whether the information was targeted or accidental. Those were the steps. And he had followed those steps for 11 years without deviation, because deviation was how men in his position ended up in the ground beside the people they were trying to protect. He read it for intelligence, That was what he told himself. By page 4, he had stopped telling himself anything. She wrote Alessandro the way you write something true, not performed truth, not the careful, constructed honesty of a man curating his own mythology. The other kind, the kind that lives in the specific details no one thinks to invent because they're too ordinary to seem significant. The way he stood with his weight slightly forward when he was containing something. The way he chose silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because language felt insufficient and insufficiency offended him. The way power sat on him, not worn, not performed, to simply present. The way altitude is present, the way cold is present, the way certain kinds of damage are present in the architecture of a person long after the original wound has scarred over. Adriano had never read himself before. It was profoundly disorienting. The chapter about Giulia was on page 47. He knew it was coming, had seen the sister mentioned in earlier pages, had registered her the way you register weather on the horizon, distant and not yet relevant. He read toward it with the same controlled pace he had maintained throughout. He stopped maintaining it on page 48. She had named her Aria. Dark-haired, she wrote, the kind of laugh that embarrassed itself. Too loud, too sudden, completely uncontainable. 19 years old and incapable of entering a room without immediately making it hers. Alessandro's only soft place, the one person for whom the walls came down without negotiation, without the slow, careful dismantling that everyone else required. She was the only one who called him by his first name, without it sounding like a question, Wren had written. Everyone else said it carefully, like they were handling something that might break them. Aria said it like it was just a word, like he was just a person. He had never told her how much that cost him to lose. Adriano put the manuscript down, stood very still for a moment, picked it up again. He didn't cry at the funeral. Wren had written. He had been raised in a world where grief was a liability, and tears were information you didn't give your enemies for free. So he stood at the graveside in the rain and felt the loss move through him like a current through stone. Present, but traceable, leaving no visible mark. And he understood, somewhere in the part of him that had always been more honest than the rest, that he was going to spend the rest of his life being haunted by the specific sound of a laugh he would never hear again. The office was very quiet. Outside, Milan continued its indifferent business. Cars, rain, the distant compression of a city that had never once adjusted itself to the emotional weather of the people living inside it. Adriano was used to that. He had built his entire professional existence on the premise that the world did not adjust for you. You adjusted for it, or you controlled it, or you accepted the damage. He had chosen control at 28, standing at a different graveside in different rain, and he had not deviated from that choice in the 8 years since. He read the ending, the part where Alessandro, after everything, after all the walls and the silence and the years of choosing marble over warmth, looked at her across a room and simply decided. No grand gesture, no declaration. Just a man who had been running the numbers on his own loneliness for long enough that the calculation finally changed. She was the variable that changed it. She didn't know. He didn't tell her. He just stopped leaving. He wanted her unsolved. He wanted her exactly as she was, a question he intended to spend the rest of his life not answering. Adriano stood at the window for a long time after that. Filippo answered before the second ring. He always did. In 11 years, Adriano had never had to call twice. "The Calloway woman," Adriano said. "I'm going to her address." A pause. Not a long pause. Filippo was too professional for long pauses, but it was there, half a breath, barely a beat, and in 11 years of working together, it was the closest thing to surprise Filippo had ever allowed himself. Sir, careful. Neutral. Would you like me to send Matteo and— No. The car, then. I can have Luca ready and I'll drive. This time the pause was a fraction longer. Adriano was aware of what he was communicating. He drove himself when he wanted no witnesses to where he was going or how he arrived. He sent Matteo when the situation required presence and the implicit threat of numbers. He sent Filippo himself when he needed something handled with precision and complete deniability. He had never, in 11 years, through interrogations and negotiations, and 3 separate occasions that had required the kind of solutions that no one discussed afterward, gone somewhere himself, alone, at midnight, for a civilian. The threat assessment, Filippo said, with the particular delicacy of a man who has learned exactly how far he can push. Should I prepare a— She's not a threat. The words landed in the quiet office with a certainty that surprised even him. He hadn't decided that consciously. But there it was, stated, final, already true before he'd examined it. W. Calloway of Via Pastrengo, 2 months behind on rent, fairy lights instead of a proper lamp, who had written his grief with more accuracy than his own memory could manage and had no idea she'd done it. Not a threat. Something else entirely. Something he didn't have a category for yet. So, sir, I'll be unreachable for 2 hours. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair. If Renata calls, tell her the Esposito filing has been delayed. If De Luca calls, don't answer, Filippo said. Yes, I know. Good. He ended the call, stood for a moment in the doorway of his office, the office that had been his father's before it was his, that smelled of old leather and the specific quality of power that accumulates in a room over decades like sediment. The manuscript was still open on his desk, the last line still on the screen. He didn't go back to read it again. He didn't need to. It was already memorized. Had been since the 3rd time he'd read it, somewhere around page 60, when he'd stopped pretending he was reading for intelligence and started reading because he couldn't stop. He took the private elevator down, walked through the underground garage without speaking to the 2 men who straightened when they saw him, got into the car alone, and drove across a rain-soaked city toward a woman who had written him true without ever knowing he was real. She heard it at 7:42 in the morning. Not a buzzer. Not the particular hollow knock of her downstairs neighbor, Signora Ferretti, who used 2 knuckles and always followed it with, Wren, cara, I made too much focaccia again, before the door was even open. 3 knocks. Unhurried. Deliberate. The kind that didn't ask whether you were home because it already knew. Wren was in her oversized cream knit sweater and yesterday's socks, hair pulled up in the specific chaos of someone who had slept on it. Wrong, halfway through her first coffee, reading back the last scene she'd written before bed. And she wasn't expecting anyone. She was never expecting anyone at 7:42 on a Wednesday morning. That was the arrangement she had made with the world, and the world had, until this moment, honored it. She padded to the door, opened it, and understood immediately, in the wordless animal way that the body understands things before the brain has finished its paperwork, that something had just gone irrevocably wrong. He filled the door frame the way weather fills a room, not aggressively, not with the performed dominance of a man who needed you to know he was dangerous. He was simply there, present at a frequency that made everything behind her suddenly feel very small, very bright, very fragile. The fairy lights on her bookshelf, the dusty rose couch, the half-drunk coffee going cold on her desk, on her entire carefully constructed small life, visible through the gap of an open door, suddenly aware of how it looked. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of coat that cost more than her rent, and wore it without mentioning it. Rain still on his shoulders from the street 3 floors below, which meant he had walked from wherever he parked, had chosen to walk, had wanted the approach to be on his own terms and at his own pace. She didn't know that yet. She just knew that the hallway, which had always seemed adequately sized for a hallway, no longer was. He looked at her. Not the way people look when they're assessing. The way they look when they've already assessed. When the information has been gathered and processed and filed, and what remains is simply the decision about what to do with it. Her pulse kicked hard against her ribs. And he's at the wrong door, she thought. He's looking for someone else. He held up his phone. Her email on the screen. Her words. Alessandro's words. The last paragraph she had written before bed. The one about wanting her unsolved. Lit up on a screen held by a man who had no business existing outside the pages she'd written him on. The air left her lungs without permission. You wrote this. Low. Unhurried. Not a question. She grabbed the door. Shoved it. His hand came up. Flat against the wood. One motion. No force whatsoever. Just stopped it. The door simply ceased to be an option. Not because he was stronger, though he was, but because the certainty behind the gesture made strength irrelevant. This was not a man who needed to force things. This was a man for whom the concept of no had been renegotiated so long ago that it barely registered as a category anymore. The door was open. She was in it. He was in the hallway. That was the situation. Say something, she thought. Wren, say something right now. I'm going to need you to not do the ominous hand-on-door thing, she said. It's very early, and I haven't finished my coffee. Something shifted in his expression. Microscopic. Gone before she could name it. Wren Calloway. That's on the lease, yes. Ghostwriter. His eyes moved. One brief sweep of her apartment through the open door. Cataloging, processing, returning to her face. You sent an email last night. I send a lot of emails. Not to this address. Apparently I do now. She held his gaze because looking away felt like conceding something she couldn't afford to give up. Her heart was hammering. She kept her voice level through sheer stubbornness. Who are you? He didn't answer immediately. The hallway light flickered once. It always did. She'd reported it 3 times. It never got fixed. And in the half-second of dimness, something moved through his expression that she couldn't translate. Then the light steadied, and his face was composed again. Still. The specific stillness that wasn't peace. She knew that stillness. She had written it for 2 years. Oh, she thought. And then, because her brain was apparently committed to understatement, even in moments of genuine crisis. Oh no. Come with me, he said. I don't know you. You know me better than most people alive. A pause that had weight to it. That is the problem we need to discuss. I'm not going anywhere with a stranger who shows up at my door at... She glanced back at the clock on her wall. 7:43 in the morning. 7:44. That's not the part of that sentence you should be correcting. He looked at her for a moment. She had the distinct impression she was being evaluated, not for threat level, not for usefulness, but for something she didn't have a word for, like a man recalibrating an equation that had just produced an unexpected result. You have 2 choices, he said. The register of his voice dropped slightly. Not louder, quieter, in the way that things go quiet before they become serious. You come with me now, willingly, and you explain to me how you came to write what you wrote, or you make the explanation unnecessary. She heard herself say it before she'd decided to. His eyes sharpened fractionally. You were going to say that, something like that. Something that sounds like a threat, but is technically deniable. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable. You're going to be difficult, he said. Not an accusation. More like a man updating a forecast. I prefer forthright. I don't. Noted. She bit her lip. glanced at her apartment, the coffee, the manuscript open on her laptop, the ordinary Wednesday morning she had been in the middle of, and felt the specific grief of watching your life become unrecognizable in real time. Can I finish my coffee first? No. Can I put on actual shoes? A pause. Yeah, generous. She stepped back from the door, didn't open it wider. Just enough. You can wait in the hall. He didn't move. In the hall, she repeated. Because I don't know you. Because it's 7:44 in the morning. Because those are the minimum conditions under which I will cooperate with whatever this is. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back. One step, just enough to make the doorway hers again. She didn't examine why that felt like a victory she'd have to pay for later. She turned, found her shoes, shoved her feet into them without untying them, grabbed her keys from the hook by the door out of pure muscle memory, then stopped, looked at the keys in her hand. Where exactly did she think she was going? Are you being kidnapped right now? She thought. Is this what this is? Is this actually happening? She looked back at him through the open door. He was exactly where she'd left him, waiting with the patience of a man who had decided the outcome and was simply allowing the process to complete itself at whatever pace she needed, which was, she was beginning to understand, somehow more frightening than impatience would have been. She put the keys in her pocket anyway, turned off the fairy lights, walked out of her apartment and into the hallway, and pulled the door shut behind her with the quiet click of someone who intended to come back. Forthright, he said, as they reached the stairs. What? You said you prefer forthright. He moved beside her, not in front, not behind, beside, which should have felt like courtesy, and instead felt like containment. See, it's an interesting word for someone who writes under other people's names. She felt the heat start up her neck. She didn't give him the satisfaction of responding, but he heard her silence. She could tell by the way he didn't fill it. By the way he let it sit between them on the staircase, knowing it said more than anything she could have answered. Outside, the morning was gray and rain-washed and indifferent. A black car sat at the curb, sleek, dark, the kind of car that doesn't advertise itself because it doesn't need to. The driver didn't get out, didn't look at her. The door opened from the inside with a soft, pressurized sound that she felt in her sternum. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. I want it noted, she said, that I'm choosing this, that I'm getting in that car because I'm choosing to. He stopped beside her and looked down at her, and she was aware, acutely, of the height difference. The particular geometry of standing next to someone who occupied space differently than other people. Not threatening. Just gravitational. Like standing at the edge of something large and feeling the pull of it in your heels. Noted, he said. And I want it noted that I have my keys. Also noted. They're not going to help me, are they? The corner of his mouth moved. Almost. Gone immediately. But she saw it. Filed it. Held onto it like a match struck in a very dark room. No, he said. They're not. She got in the car. The door closed behind her with that same pressurized sound, and the city immediately became distant, muffled, separated, belonging to someone else's morning now. The leather was soft, in the way that things are soft when money has had time to settle into them. It smelled of sandalwood and rain, and something darker underneath, something clean and sharp that she recognized without being able to name. She stared straight ahead. He got in beside her. The car pulled away from her street smoothly, without hurry, with the confidence of a vehicle that has never once had to stop for traffic. She watched Via Pastrengo disappear in the side mirror. Her apartment, her coffee, her ordinary Wednesday morning. You're being incredibly calm about this, she told herself. You're not calm, she told herself back. Your heart rate is approximately that of a hummingbird. Yes, but he doesn't know that. She felt him look at her. He might know that, she amended silently. She lasted 4 minutes before she spoke. The email was a mistake, she said to the windscreen. I meant to send it to a client. Same first name, different domain. I didn't check. Silence. The manuscript is fiction. Alessandro is a fictional character. I researched the Italian legal world for background detail, and some of it overlapped with whatever you think it overlapped with. That's all it was. More silence. She turned to look at him. He was watching the city go past the window, with the expression of a man listening to something that wasn't the words being spoken. You don't believe me, she said. I believe you didn't intend to send it. His eyes moved from the window to her face. Dark, steady. The particular quality of attention that made you feel simultaneously examined and exposed. Whether you intended to write it is a different question. Her breath hitched. Well, what does that mean? He held her gaze for a moment longer, then returned to the window. It means we have things to discuss, Wren. Her name in his mouth. She had written that too. The way Alessandro said the FMC's name, like he'd decided it was his before he said it out loud. She faced forward, kept her hands very still in her lap, watched Milan move past the windows like a city that had been expecting this and simply hadn't told her. The elevator required a key. She noticed that first. Not a code, not a fingerprint, not a button you pressed and waited for. A physical key, which meant the floor they were going to didn't exist on the building's official architecture, which meant the building knew he was coming and had arranged itself accordingly, which meant she was 30 seconds from a place that the rest of the world didn't have access to. Still choosing this, she told herself. The elevator opened directly into the apartment. It wasn't what she expected. She didn't know what she expected. Something aggressively luxurious, perhaps. Gold fixtures, ostentatious art, the performed wealth of a man who needed you to know what you were standing inside. It wasn't that. It was vast, and it was still, and it was the most quietly expensive thing she had ever walked into. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, the city spread below like a circuit board someone had breathed life into. Lights moving, rain still dragging across the skyline. The whole of Milan laid out 30 stories, down with the particular smallness of things that have been elevated past. Dark stone floors, some furniture in charcoal and slate, a desk in the far corner that held nothing except 1 lamp and 1 file, and the specific austerity of a workspace that has never tolerated clutter. No photographs, no softness, nothing that said someone lives here. Everything that said someone rules here. She stepped out of the elevator and felt the space register her, felt the scale of it press down gently on her shoulders, felt her cream-knit sweater and her untied shoes and her general Wrenness become suddenly, acutely visible in a room that had been designed to make everything small. Behind her, he moved to a cabinet along the far wall, the sound of crystal, the particular, unhurried music of a man performing a ritual he had performed 10,000 times. 2 glasses. He carried them to the low table between the windows and the couch and set one down on her side. Didn't ask, didn't gesture toward it, just placed it in the architecture of the room as though it had always been there, and moved to stand at the glass. She looked at the glass, didn't touch it, looked at the city instead. Sit, he said. I'm fine standing. Wren. Just her name, the way he'd said it in the car, like a period at the end of a sentence he'd already finished. Like ownership so settled, it didn't require announcement. She sat. Not because she was told to, because her legs had been making this argument for the last 40 minutes and had apparently decided to stop losing it gracefully. She perched on the edge of the couch, spine straight, hands in her lap. The posture of someone who intended to leave soon and wanted their body to remember that. The glass sat 3 inches from her right hand. Expensive crystal. Something amber inside it. It smelled of bourbon and something smoother underneath. She moved her hand to her knee. He turned from the window. "How did you know about the grief?" he said. "Not tell me about Alessandro, not explain the manuscript. Straight to the marrow of it. The way a man goes straight to the marrow of things when he has decided that the surrounding tissue is irrelevant. I told you. Alessandro is fictional." He crossed the room toward her, unhurried, the way everything he did was unhurried, the way a man moves when he has decided that urgency is something that happens to other people. He stopped at the table, picked up her manuscript and opened it to a page he had already marked. He read. His voice was low, unhurried. The particular register of a man who understood that volume was the amateur's tool. The grief didn't live in his face. That was what people misunderstood. They looked for it there and found nothing and decided he had none. But it lived lower than that, in the shoulders, in the set of them, in the specific weight they carried that had nothing to do with posture, and everything to do with something that had been placed there and never removed. If you knew where to look, you could see it. She knew where to look. She had always known, in the way that some people simply know things about other people. Not from evidence, not from deduction, just from the particular frequency of recognition. He closed the manuscript, set it down. But looked at her. Her throat had gone completely dry. "Alessandro is fictional," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was unreasonably proud of that. "Then explain the shoulders." It's a common detail. It's the kind of thing that... Wren." The way he said her name this time was different, quieter. The kind of quiet that isn't distance. The kind that's proximity. That's attention. That's a man reducing the space between 2 points, not by moving his body, but by the sheer directed weight of his focus. She bit her lip. His eyes tracked the movement. She stopped. He moved then. Not to the window. Not to the desk. Toward her, rounding the table slowly, with the particular patience of something that has already decided on its destination and sees no reason to rush the arrival. She tracked him the way you track something that your instincts have flagged, not with fear exactly, not yet, but with the full allocation of attention that the body reserves for things that require it. He stopped close, closer than a stranger should, close enough that she could smell him properly for the first time. Sandalwood, yes, and beneath it something darker, cleaner, the scent of expensive restraint, of a man who controlled everything, including the chemical information he released into a room, close enough that the warmth of him reached her before any part of him did, close enough that she had to make a conscious decision about where to look, and every option felt like a concession. She looked up. Well, he was watching her the way he'd watched her in the car, with that quality of attention that felt less like observation and more like cataloging, like she was a text he was reading for the second time, looking for the things he missed on the first pass. "You're shaking," he said. "I'm not." "Your hands." She looked down. Her hands were perfectly still on her knees. She looked back up. "My hands are completely..." "They were," he said. "In the car. When I said your name." She opened her mouth, closed it. The worst part, the part she would think about later, in the particular insomnia of nights when something has happened that your brain refuses to file and move past, was that he wasn't wrong. In the car, when he'd said Wren for the second time, and something in her hands had done something involuntary and brief, and she had pressed them flat against her thighs and told herself it was the cold. It was not the cold. "My penthouse is 22 degrees, he said. Quiet. Almost gentle, in the way that a scalpel is almost gentle. Precise, purposeful, designed to open things. "Try again." The heat crawled up her neck so fast, she felt it arrive at her face before she could stop it. "Fine," she said. "You're unsettling. Congratulations. I imagine that's a hobby of yours." "It's not." "Then you're naturally gifted." Something moved through his expression. Not a smile. He didn't smile. She was already learning that, already cataloging the alternatives he used instead. A shift. A fractional adjustment in the quality of his attention. As though she had just done something that required him to update a calculation. He stepped back. One step. Just enough. She breathed. He went to the window. She reached for the glass, stopped herself, put her hand back in her lap. "Don't," she thought. "That's not water. That's not just a drink. That's a choice, and you know what it means, and you're not." "You haven't touched it," he said to the glass. "I noticed." "Why?" "Because you poured it without asking." A pause. "You prefer to be asked." "I prefer to be treated like a person who walked in here voluntarily, and not like a guest at a dinner party I didn't RSVP to." He turned from the window, looked at her across the room, the full length of the penthouse between them, which should have felt like relief, and instead felt like a different kind of tension. The kind that stretches. "You did walk in voluntarily," he said, "under duress. You put your own shoes on. You gave me 30 seconds. The shift in his expression again. That fractional thing. There and gone. He crossed back to the table, picked up his own glass, drank, set it down, looked at her manuscript. "Alessandro," he said. In chapter 9, he watches her across a room. She went still. "He doesn't move toward her," Adriano continued, his voice taking on that low, unhurried quality again, the one that meant he had already been somewhere and was simply describing it from the other side. He stands at the window, and he thinks. She doesn't know yet. She doesn't know that every door she walks through from this moment is a door I already know about. She doesn't know that I've already decided. He looked up from the manuscript. At her, across a penthouse that was 30 stories above a city she no longer had access to. "You wrote that," he said. Her pulse was very loud. "Yes," she said. "Why?" The question sat in the room between them. Simple. Unanswerable. The kind of question that only works when the person asking already knows the answer and is waiting to see if you're brave enough to say it out loud. She picked up the glass, drank. It was very good bourbon. Of course it was. She set it down and looked at him and said, "Because I wanted someone to mean it." The silence that followed was the longest of the chapter. He looked at her. Really looked. The way he hadn't yet. The way she hadn't realized he'd been withholding until he stopped withholding it. Something in the quality of his attention shifted entirely. The cataloging stopped. The assessment stopped. What replaced it didn't have a name yet. She felt it on her skin before she understood it. Felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not painful, not exactly pleasant, just significant. The body registering that something has changed in the atmosphere and flagging it for attention. He looked away first. Back to the window. Back to the city. Back to the 30 stories of distance between this room and the ground. She sat with the bourbon warming her chest and the ghost of his attention still on her skin, and said nothing. Outside, rain pressed against the glass. The city moved 30 stories below, indifferent and ongoing, full of people in apartments with proper lamps who were having completely ordinary Wednesday mornings. She thought about her cold coffee on her desk. She thought about the fairy lights she'd turned off. She thought about the keys in her pocket that weren't going to help her. And underneath all of it, quieter and more dangerous than any of it, she thought about the way he'd said, "I've already decided," in her own words, in his voice, in a room she hadn't chosen and couldn't leave, and felt, somewhere she wasn't ready to examine, that she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. She found it because she couldn't sit still. That was the truth of it. Not curiosity, not investigation, not the particular nosiness of a woman trying to gather intelligence on a dangerous man. Just the simple, restless inability to remain on a couch in a strange room, while the strange room's owner stood at a window saying nothing, and the silence between them accumulated like weather. She had lasted 11 minutes after the bourbon. Then she stood up, saw he didn't stop her, didn't turn from the window. Just tracked her. She could feel it, the way you feel a change in the direction of light. Present without being visible. Watching without watching. She moved to the bookshelves. They ran the full length of the interior wall, floor to ceiling, which in this room meant considerable, and held the specific collection of a man who read for function rather than comfort. Law, history, political theory, economics. Several titles in Italian she couldn't fully parse, a few in what looked like French. No fiction. Nothing with a broken spine or a folded page or any of the small, affectionate damage that accumulates on books that have been loved rather than used. Except one shelf, third from the top. A gap in the architecture of the collection, not empty, just different, and a small cluster of things that didn't belong with the rest. A watch that wasn't being worn. A folded piece of paper she didn't touch. A small painting, no larger than a hardback book, propped against the spines of the volumes behind it. And a photograph. She didn't pick it up. She just looked. A girl. Dark-haired, slight, caught mid-laugh in the particular way of someone who didn't know they were being photographed. The unguarded kind of joy that performs for no one. 19, perhaps 20. On a boat, the sea behind her breaking white, and the sun doing something extraordinary to the water. She was wearing a yellow dress, and her hair was going everywhere, and she looked like the kind of person who walked into rooms and immediately made them hers. Wren knew her. Not her face. Her face was new, was specific, or was a real person's face that she had never seen before. But the quality of her, the laugh, the particular luminosity of someone who existed in the lives of guarded people as the one soft place, the one point of entry, the one voice that said their name like it was just a word and not a question. She had written this girl. She had called her Aria and given her dark hair and a laugh that embarrassed itself, and a yellow dress in Chapter 4 and a boat in Chapter 7, and she had killed her in Chapter 8 and written Alessandro's grief like she knew exactly what it weighed. Oh, she thought, very quietly. Oh no. Who is she? She heard herself say it before she decided to. The question arrived in the room without her permission. Genuine, soft. The voice of someone who already knew the answer and was asking anyway, because not asking felt worse. The quality of the silence changed. She felt it before she turned around. The particular shift in atmospheric pressure that she had been learning in the last several hours to read as weather, as warning. She turned. He had moved from the window. She didn't know when, hadn't heard it, hadn't felt the approach, just turned and found the room rearranged. He was standing very still near the center of the space, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen yet. The others she'd cataloged, the assessment, the fractional shift of recalibration, the something without a name that had replaced them in the moment she'd told him she wanted someone to mean it. This was none of those. This was the thing underneath all of them. "Well, put it down," he said. She hadn't picked it up. She didn't correct him. She took one step back from the shelf, slow, careful, the instinctive movement of someone who has just understood that the geography of the room has changed and needs to update her position accordingly. I didn't touch it, she said. I was just looking. Put it down. Each word its own sentence, its own verdict. The voice had dropped to something that wasn't quite sound anymore, something that operated below the frequency of normal speech and registered instead in the chest, in the base of the throat, in the place where the body stores its oldest warnings. She's in the novel, Wren said. Don't, said every sensible part of her brain. Stop talking right now. She kept talking. I called her Aria. I wrote her on a boat, and I gave her a yellow dress and a laugh that her voice caught slightly. I wrote her, Adriano. I wrote her, before I knew you existed. He crossed the room in 4 steps. Not running, not lunging. 4 steps at a pace that had no hurry in it, and no mercy in it either. The pace of absolute certainty, of a man who had already decided what happened next, and was simply closing the distance to it. She backed up. The bookshelf met her spine before she'd taken 2 steps. His arm came up, not grabbing her, not touching her, just landing flat against the shelf beside her head with a sound like a door closing. His other hand found the shelf on her other side, and the world reduced itself, immediately and completely, to the space between his arms. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and could smell the sandalwood and the darker thing beneath it. Could see, for the first time, the fine detail of his face at a distance that strangers were not supposed to occupy. The jaw set hard, the muscle working there, the eyes that were doing something she had no category for. Not anger. Anger she could have handled. Anger had edges you could find and navigate. This was the thing anger becomes when it has nowhere to go. How? A whisper. So quiet she felt it more than heard it. Felt it move against her hair, against the side of her face, felt it in her sternum like a frequency. How do you know that? I told you I don't. How do you know about the dress? I didn't. I swear to you I didn't know. The boat, the laugh. His voice dropped further, which she hadn't thought was possible. No one knows about the laugh. I've never told anyone. He stopped. The silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She didn't move, didn't breathe in any way that required effort or decision. Just stayed very still with the bookshelf at her back, and his arms bracketing her, and her heart doing something completely unreasonable in her chest, and looked up at him and waited. He was searching her face. She had felt him look at her before, had catalogued the different qualities of his attention, had learned to read the variations. But this was different. This wasn't assessment. This wasn't cataloging. This was a man standing at the edge of something and looking for a reason not to step off it. Looking for the lie. Not finding it. She watched it happen. Watched him search and come up empty. And watched the dangerous, terrible anger move through him like a current looking for ground and finding none. Watched it reach the end of its circuit and collapse into something that had no name and no armor and no 8 years of careful architecture to hide behind. Recognition. Raw. Unguarded. The expression of a man who has spent the better part of a decade making sure he would never again be seen by anyone, and has just discovered that someone saw him anyway. Quietly, accidentally, in the dark, on a page that was never meant for him. His breath left him. Slow, almost inaudible. The arm beside her head didn't move, but the quality of it changed. The force went out of it, not the proximity, just the force, the barely contained lethality of it, replaced by something she had no word for, except weight. The weight of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has just, without deciding to, set it down. Her name was Giulia, he said. Past tense. 2 words. She felt them land in her chest like stones dropped into still water. Felt the ripple of them move outward and outward and not stop. She didn't say she was sorry. She had learned from years of writing grief that sorry was the word people used when they didn't know what else to offer. Alessandro had never wanted sorry. He had wanted someone to stay in the room with it, to not flinch, to not reach for the nearest comfortable thing and use it to cover the wound back up. So she didn't say sorry. She stayed in the room with it. 3 seconds, maybe 4. His arm beside her head, her back against his books, with the photograph of Giulia on the shelf between them like a witness to something that had no adequate language. Then he stepped back. Not far. Just enough. Just the restoration of the minimum distance that two people were supposed to maintain when they were strangers, which they were, technically, still. He went to the window. She stayed at the bookshelf. The city continued 30 stories below. Indifferent. Ongoing. Completely unaware that something had just broken open in a room above it with no sound at all. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the specific weight of them that she had described on page 12 without knowing it was real, without knowing it belonged to an actual man who actually carried it, and who had been carrying it for 8 years through courtrooms and boardrooms and the particular loneliness of a life built to be impenetrable. He was the only one who called him by his first name, without it sounding like a question, she had written. Everyone else said it carefully, like they were handling something that might break them. Aria said it like it was just a word, like he was just a person. He had never told her how much that cost him to lose. She looked at the back of his head. Adriano, she said. He went very still. Not the controlled stillness, the other kind, the kind that happens when something reaches you before your defenses do. She hadn't planned to say it like that. She hadn't planned to say it at all. It had simply arrived. The way things arrived with her, the way she wrote, from somewhere below the level of decision, from the frequency of recognition that she had apparently been tuned to her entire life without knowing what it was receiving for. Just his name, like it was just a word, like he was just a person. He didn't turn around for a long time. When he did, his face was composed. The walls were back. She could see the reconstruction of them, could see the careful architecture reassembling itself in real time, could see the man who had never lost a court case and never allowed an enemy a point of entry re-inhabiting his own expression. But it wasn't complete. There was a fracture in it, barely visible, the kind that runs through stone after something has moved underground, not obvious from a distance, but present, permanent, the evidence of a shift that cannot be undone. She filed it, held it, said nothing, but he looked at her across the room for a moment. This woman in a cream-knit sweater in his penthouse, with her untied shoes and her borrowed bourbon and her impossible, accidental, catastrophic knowledge of the one thing he had never shown anyone. Then he moved to the couch, sat, not commanding, not assessing, just sat, with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been standing for 8 years and has just, briefly, forgotten why. He picked up her manuscript from the table, didn't open it, just held it. "Sit down, Wren," he said. Not an order this time, something adjacent to a request. She crossed the room, sat. Not on the edge this time, not with the posture of someone about to leave. Outside, the rain had softened to something almost quiet. The city moved below them in its permanent, indifferent way. The bourbon was still on the table, so neither of them touched it. They sat in the particular silence of two people who have just survived something together and are not yet ready to discuss what it was. It was, Wren thought, the most honest room she had ever been in. They ordered food at some point. She didn't remember who suggested it, didn't remember the decision being made at all, only the quiet appearance of it, the way things appeared in this penthouse, as though the logistics of living happened in a separate layer of reality that she didn't have access to. Bread, and something warm, and 2 small dishes she couldn't name but ate anyway, because it turned out that being kidnapped, accompanying someone voluntarily, across a rain-soaked city, and surviving an emotional detonation in their living room made a person genuinely hungry. Now Adriano ate with the focused economy of a man for whom food was function. She ate the way she did everything, slightly too fast, slightly too much, distracted by the view and the silence and the ongoing, low-grade impossibility of the situation. The city had gone dark below them. Properly dark, the particular darkness of late evening, when the working lights gave way to the living ones, and Milan became a different organism entirely. Warmer. More human. Still 30 stories below and entirely inaccessible. But warmer. She had stopped counting the hours. He had moved to the desk at some point during the quiet, not working, or not visibly working, though she suspected that for a man like Adriano, the line between existing and calculating was not a clear one. Just sitting. Her manuscript on the desk in front of him, closed, his hand resting on the cover with a stillness that might have been unconscious and might not have been. She was on the couch, not perched this time, properly on it, legs pulled up, shoes finally off, the posture of someone whose body had made a unilateral decision about the pretense of imminent departure. She had her knees against her chest and her cream sweater pulled down over her hands, and she was watching the rain trace itself down the glass and trying to remember the last time she had spent an entire day in one room with another person. She couldn't. That's sad, she thought. Then, don't examine that right now. Can I ask you something? He looked up from the manuscript. She had been quiet for long enough that her own voice surprised her slightly. It landed in the room with the particular vulnerability of questions asked in the dark, the kind that only get asked because the dark makes them feel safer than they are. You can ask, he said, which was not the same as yes, but wasn't no either. Why did you come yourself? He was still. You could have sent someone, she said. You have people. I've gathered that much. You could have sent someone to retrieve the email, or retrieve me, or whatever the protocol is for this kind of thing. But you came yourself. She watched him. At midnight, in the rain, to a third-floor walk-up on Via Pastrengo. The silence stretched. Your point, he said. My point is that you didn't have to. And men like you, she paused, reorganizing. Men who have people. They don't do things they don't have to do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, picked up the manuscript, and crossed the room toward the couch. He sat, not beside her, not quite, but close enough that the cushion registered him, dipped, fractionally, toward his weight. She felt the shift of it in her spine, felt the small gravitational adjustment the couch made to accommodate him, and by proximity, the small gravitational adjustment she made too. She didn't move away. He set the manuscript on his knee, didn't open it. I read it, he said. That's why I came. You read a lot of things. Not like this. A pause. The quality of it different. Thinner. Somehow. More permeable than the silences that had preceded it. I read one page to assess the threat. That was the function. He looked down at the manuscript cover. I read the rest because I couldn't stop. She said nothing. Ah, that hasn't happened before, he said. In 34 years. A thing I couldn't stop. The rain moved against the glass. The city below breathed its late evening breath. She was aware of the warmth of him beside her, not touching, just present in the way that very few people had ever been present in the same space as her. Fully, without the performance of it. Which part? She asked quietly. Which part couldn't you stop? He opened the manuscript. She knew before he found the page. Knew it the way she knew things. From the frequency of it, from the resonance, from the 2 years she had spent writing it, and the 11 hours she had spent inside the reality it had apparently described. He read. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't need to. He had already decided. And somewhere between the moment she first defied him and the moment she first saw through him, that she was the only variable in his life he had no interest in solving. He wanted her unsolved. He wanted her exactly as she was. A question he intended to spend the rest of his life not answering. He closed the manuscript, set it on the table. "No one has ever written me that way," he said. The words landed in the room like something irrevocable. Not a confession exactly. He said it with too much composure for confession, with the careful delivery of a man who has chosen precisely these words and no others, and understands the weight of each one. But underneath the composure, underneath the precision, she heard it. The thing that the words were carrying, the specific, unwieldy, but 8 years in the making truth of a man who had been seen by no one for so long that being seen had become theoretical. Until a 25-year-old ghostwriter on Via Pastrengo had accidentally sent him proof that she'd been seeing him for 2 years without knowing he existed. "Alessandro isn't you," she said, quietly, carefully. "No. He's who I needed to believe existed." "I know. That's different from, I know what it is, Wren." Her name, again. That way. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. Had been, she realized, since he sat down. With that quality of attention that she had stopped trying to categorize because it didn't fit any category she'd had before today. "Then what are you saying?" she asked. "Actually saying." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm saying that a man who doesn't believe in coincidence drove across a city at midnight because a stranger wrote the inside of him down." His voice was low, level, the precision of it somehow making it more rather than less. "I'm saying I've spent 8 years making sure nothing got past the architecture, and I'm saying you did it without trying, without knowing, without—" He stopped, looked at her. "Without even knowing I was real," he finished. The space between them had been shrinking. She hadn't tracked it consciously, hadn't noted the incremental reduction of distance the way she might have noted it an hour ago, when every inch of space between them had felt like something to monitor and maintain. It had just happened. The way the cushion had dipped, the way gravity worked on things that were close enough to feel each other's pull. He reached up slowly. His thumb traced her lower lip. Barely a touch. The lightest possible contact. More question than statement. The kind of touch that existed at the exact boundary between restraint and surrender. She felt it everywhere. Felt it in her hands, in her sternum, in the sudden, complete silence of every thought she'd had for the last 11 hours. She didn't move. "I should let you go," he said. Quiet. The quietest she'd heard him. Not the dangerous quiet, not the weapon of it, just the plain, undefended truth of it. "You understand what I am, what this is, what letting you stay means." "I know. I'm not a man who—" He stopped again, looked at her with the fracture still visible in his expression, the one from the bookshelf, the one she'd caused by saying his name like it was just a word. "I've never been a good man, Wren. I know that too. And you're not afraid." "I'm terrified," she said. "It's not the same thing." Something moved through his expression, fast and unguarded, and completely at odds with everything he had shown her before today, like weather breaking through cloud cover, like something that had been pressed down for 8 years, finding a momentary gap in the architecture. His hand moved from her lip to her jaw, cupped it. Barely. The restraint of it more devastating than force would have been. He leaned in. The knock hit the door like a gunshot. One word through the wood. Italian. Low and urgent and carrying the specific register of a man who would not have interrupted unless the alternative was worse. Adriano went still. 1 second. 2. His hand dropped. He stood in a single motion, fluid, immediate, the softness of the last 30 seconds dissolving so completely that she almost doubted it had happened. Almost, except for the specific temperature of her jaw where his hand had been, except for the way her lungs were still recalibrating. He buttoned his jacket, looked at her once. Stay here. Not a request. She stayed. The door closed behind him with the same pressurized sound as the car. Engineered. Final. The sound of a world that closed itself off at will, that admitted and expelled on its own terms, that had its own logic and its own laws and its own gravity that operated entirely independently of what she wanted or didn't want. She sat in the center of his couch, in the center of his penthouse, in the center of his city, put her hand to her own jaw where his had been, dropped it, looked at the manuscript on the table. Her words. Her Alessandro. Her 2 years of writing a man she believed she had invented because the alternative, that he existed, that the world contained him, that she had somehow known him across the distance of fiction and reality, and an entire life lived without him, was too large a thing to look at directly. He's not Alessandro, she told herself. No, she agreed. He's worse. He's real. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city below was quiet in the way that expensive cities get quiet late at night. Not empty, just distilled. The essential version of itself. All the noise gone, leaving only the light and the structure and the particular, enduring fact of it. She looked at the glass, at her own reflection in it, small, cream-sweatered, barefoot on a couch 30 stories above a city she had no way to get back to on her own. She thought about the fairy lights she'd turned off, about the cold coffee on her desk, about the ordinary Wednesday morning she had been in the middle of when 3 knocks had rearranged the entire coordinate system of her life. She should want to leave. She did want to leave. Both of those things were true, and she was done pretending they were the only things that were true. I've never been a good man, Wren. I know, she had said. And she did know. She had always known, had written it for 2 years, had understood it in the architecture of him from the moment he filled her doorframe, had felt it in every careful, deliberate, devastating inch of the distance he'd maintained, and then closed. She knew exactly what he was. She just hadn't expected it to feel like this. Like coming home to a place she had only ever visited in her imagination. Like the cage had a key. Like she was the one holding it. She found out about the building on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate somehow. Tuesdays were the day her life had a habit of rearranging itself without asking permission. The letter arrived in her mailbox between a takeaway menu and her electricity bill. Formal letterhead, the name of a property management company she didn't recognize, informing her in the careful language of people who handled large sums of money on behalf of other people that the building at Via Pastrengo had been acquired by a new owner, that all outstanding rent arrears across all units had been cleared as of the 1st of the month, that her monthly rate had been locked. Locked, when the letter said, as though rates were things that ran away if you didn't secure them, for the next 10 years. She read it twice, stood in the lobby in her cream knit sweater, a different one. The original had acquired a small burn from a candle she'd been burning too close to the desk, but she'd replaced it with one almost identical because some things you didn't change, and read it a 3rd time. Then she went upstairs, sat on the dusty rose couch, picked up her phone. He answered on the 2nd ring. He always answered on the 2nd ring. She had asked him about it once. Why not the 1st? Why not the 3rd? And he had looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his. "I'm deciding how honest to be" expression, and said, "The first ring is for emergencies. The third is for people I don't want to talk to. The second is..." He had stopped there. "Is what?" she had pushed. "Considered," he had said, and looked at his phone like the conversation was over. She had written that down afterward. She wrote a lot of things down now. "You bought my building," she said. A pause. The specific pause of a man who had been expecting this call and had prepared for it and was now implementing the preparation. The investment made sense. Adriano. The neighborhood is developing. The Adriano. Silence. Then, "You were going to lose the apartment." She closed her eyes. She had been, actually. 2 months of arrears had become. 3 had become a letter she'd stopped opening because some problems feel smaller when you don't look directly at them. She had told herself she would fix it. They had been telling herself that with the specific optimism of a woman who had been quietly drowning in the shallow end for long enough that it had started to feel like swimming. He had known. Of course he had known. She had learned in 8 months that Adriano Vitale's knowledge of things was not bounded by what she told him. It operated on its own terms, quietly, comprehensively. In the background of her life, like a current, she couldn't see, but occasionally felt moving beneath her. "You should have told me," she said. "You would have said no." "I would have said, it was none of your..." "Business," he finished. "Yes. Which is why I didn't tell you." She opened her eyes, looked at the fairy lights on the bookshelf. Still there, still the same, and still the warm, impractical glow of a woman who had chosen atmosphere over adequacy years ago and never reconsidered it. They were on, even now, even in the middle of the afternoon, because she had stopped turning them off when she left the apartment. He had a key. She had given it to him 6 months ago, standing in this same lobby, holding it out without a speech or a ceremony, because it hadn't required either. He had looked at it for a moment, at the small, ordinary brass fact of it, and taken it with the careful hands of a man receiving something that had no monetary value and knew it. He used it quietly. Always at the end of his day. Late, usually. The hour when Milan had finished its business, and the city belonged to the people who lived there, rather than the people who ran it. He never announced himself. She would hear the lock, the soft, particular sound of it, and then his footsteps on her floor. Different from anyone else's footsteps. Slower, more deliberate. The walk of a man who had learned to move through the world at his own pace and saw no reason to adjust it. He always brought something. Coffee, sometimes, though she was usually awake. Silence, often. The specific quality of his silence that she had learned to read like a second language. Once, memorably, a book she had mentioned in passing 3 weeks before that she hadn't expected him to remember, that he'd set on her desk without comment, and then sat on her couch and waited for her to finish her sentence. She always finished her sentence. He always waited. "I'm going to pay you back," she said into the phone. "You're not." Adriano. Wren. The way he said her name. Still the same. Still that quality of ownership so settled it didn't require announcement. But different too now. Warmer in some frequency she hadn't known names existed for until 8 months of learning him had given her the vocabulary. "Let it go. You can't just..." "I can. That's not the... I'll be there at 9. She exhaled, looked at the ceiling. "You're infuriating," she told it. "I know," he said. 9 o'clock. The call ended. She sat for a moment with the phone in her lap and the letter on the cushion beside her, and the fairy lights doing their small, warm, completely impractical best against the afternoon. He moved the world around her, she thought. That's what he does. He doesn't announce it. He doesn't ask permission. He just quietly, comprehensively, in the background, removes the things that could hurt her. And she had written that too once. Alessandro, in chapter 17, doing something she had thought at the time was too much, too possessive, too overreaching, the kind of love that swallowed the person it was directed at. She had almost cut it. She was glad now that she hadn't. He arrived at 8:53. She heard the lock, that soft, particular sound. And then his footsteps. Then the specific quality of stillness that meant he had stopped in the doorway of the room she was in and was doing what he always did for the first few seconds, just looking at her, taking the temperature of her, reading whatever it was he read when he looked at her that way. She didn't look up from her laptop. "You're early," she said. "You're still working," he said. Not a criticism, just the noting of a fact he found she had come to understand, some privately satisfying. That she worked, that she had a thing she returned to, that the laptop was always open, and the manuscript was always accumulating, and the Wren who lived in this apartment had not changed into something unrecognizable just because his key was on her hook. He hadn't wanted to change her. That was the thing she had understood slowly. Then, all at once, somewhere around month 3, he hadn't brought her into his world and tried to make her fit it. He had found his way into hers, into the fairy lights and the dusty rose couch and the cold tea and the working too late, and simply become part of it. Added himself to the small, warm, carefully constructed life of a woman who had always had enough room for one more thing and hadn't known it. She heard him set something on the kitchen counter, heard him cross the room. The couch accepted his weight. That same dip, that same gravitational adjustment, 8 months of practice, and it still did something to her equilibrium. She suspected it always would. He looked at her screen. She angled it toward him without being asked. It was new. Not the Alessandro novel. She had finished that 6 months ago, had printed it once, had put it in the drawer of her bedside table where it lived now, like a record of something she no longer needed to wish for. This was different. Smaller to start with, still finding its shape. It began. He arrived at her door like a verdict. She let him in anyway. He read the first page in silence. She watched him read, watched the quality of his attention settle onto the words, the way it settled onto everything he chose to give his focus to. Complete, unhurried. The particular stillness of a man who had learned, in the last 8 months, that her writing was something he was allowed to be near, that she would show him, that the pages were not something she hid from him the way she had hidden them from everyone else. He had never taken that for granted. She had never stopped noticing that he didn't. He reached the end of the page, looked up. She let him in anyway, he said. She did. Why? She looked at him, at the fracture she had caused in chapter 5, still faintly visible if you knew where to look, the evidence of a shift that had never fully closed, that she suspected now it never would, that she had stopped wanting it to. At the man who had read 1 page of her manuscript to assess a threat and read the rest because he couldn't stop, who had driven across a rain-soaked city at midnight to find the person who had written him true, who had bought her building and cleared her debts and brought her coffee and waited for her to finish her sentences and held her jaw like something worth holding, who had never once in 8 months tried to make her into something that fit more neatly into his world, who had simply chosen, deliberately, completely, like a man who had finally found a variable he had no interest in solving. Because she already knew him, she said. She just hadn't met him yet. Something moved through his expression, that fast, unguarded thing, the one she had first seen in chapter 6, and had been collecting ever since, cataloging every version of it, storing them in the part of her that wrote things down, He looked at her for a moment with the fracture fully visible and the walls entirely down and the specific exhausted relief of a man who has stopped running from the thing that was always going to catch him. Then he reached over, closed her laptop. "Come here," he said. Not a command. Not quite. Something new. Something that had no word yet in the language of the man she had met in her doorway 8 months ago. Something that lived in the territory between "I'm asking" and "I already know the answer," and had been built, slowly and without announcement, from 8 months of coffee and silence and brass keys and the particular gravity of two people who had found each other in the most impossible way and decided, separately and then together, that impossible was not the same as wrong. She closed the laptop the rest of the way, moved toward him. The fairy lights were on. They were always on now. Outside, Milan moved through its evening in its permanent, indifferent way. All that noise, all that light, all that city happening 30 stories below, and a world away, and entirely unconcerned with the woman on the dusty rose couch who had once written a man into existence. And then, through the specific grace of a careless Tuesday night and a wrong email address, had somehow been lucky enough to find him real. She published a novel 8 months later. Not the Alessandro one. That stayed in the drawer. That was hers. Had always been hers. Would always be hers. The private record of a longing she no longer needed to carry alone. This one had a different name on the cover. Her name. W. Calloway. No ghost. No client. No careful anonymity of a woman who had spent years writing devotion for other people under other people's names. Just hers. It began. He arrived at her door like a verdict. She let him in anyway. The dedication page said, "For the man who read 1 page to assess the threat, and stayed for the rest." She had shown it to him before it went to print, sitting on the couch with the fairy lights on and the city dark outside, and his coffee going cold on the table, the way her tea always went cold, because some things, she had decided, were genetic. He had read the dedication twice, said nothing for long enough that she had started to prepare a defense. Then he had closed the manuscript, set it on the table, and said her name in the way he said it, the way that was only hers, that had always been only hers. And that sounded like a decision he had made and had no intention of revisiting. "Print it," he said. She printed it. The Vitale name still made rooms go quiet. In her apartment on Via Pastrengo, 3rd floor, one window with good light. It made a different kind of quiet. The kind with room in it. The kind that two people build slowly, in the spaces between words. In the choosing, again and again and again, of the same person. Every morning and every evening and every Tuesday in between. He wanted her unsolved, she had written, 2 years ago, in a dark apartment with fairy lights and cold tea, writing a man she believed she had invented. She understood now what she had actually been doing. She had been writing her way home